On July 4th, 1776, a brand new nation was born, one that was destined to grow from just a handful of rebellious colonies into a global superpower. But this rise to the top was anything but peaceful. It was forged in conflict, in ambition, and in some really profound contradictions. So let's get into how it all happened. You'll hear people call the United States a modern Roman Empire. And if we really want to understand where it's headed, well, we have to look back at where it came from. We have to understand its past, a story of incredible growth, sure, but also one of deep, deep conflict. And that's really the big question we're tackling today. We're going to trace the story of how the United States was basically hammered into shape on the anvil of war, all the way from the first European settlements to the bloody clash that literally tore the nation apart and redefined its very soul. Okay, so our story doesn't really kick off with a single event. It actually begins with this brutal, centuries-long struggle, as all these European powers were racing to claim a foothold in North America, a land, by the way, that had been home to complex societies for thousands of years. So for more than 250 years, this was a land of competing empires. You had Spain founding St. Augustine, that's the first permanent European settlement. Then the English show up at Jamestown, mostly driven by money. And not long after, the Pilgrims arrive at Plymouth, looking for religious freedom. All of these competing interests, they just set the stage for a massive collision, which finally exploded with the French and Indian War. Now, Britain's victory was a total game changer. They kicked France right out of North America and suddenly had this massive new empire. But winning came at a staggering cost. And to pay off its enormous war debt, Britain turned to the one place it thought it could squeeze for cash: its American colonies. And after that, things just spiraled out of control and fast. First, you get new taxes on trade, like the Sugar Act. Then comes the first direct tax, the Stamp Act, and that is what lit the fuse of no taxation without representation. Tensions just boiled over into violence with the Boston Massacre, and Britain's response, these punitive, intolerable acts, was for many colonists the absolute final straw. And then it happened. On a quiet morning in Lexington, Massachusetts, a single mysterious shot rings out between colonial militiamen and British regulars. To this day, nobody really knows who fired first. But you know what? It didn't matter. The war for independence had begun. So, the war for independence is won, but the new nation is immediately facing a new kind of challenge. It was founded on this incredible, revolutionary idea of liberty, but it was born with a profound and frankly undeniable contradiction right at its very core. Just listen to these words. They are the bedrock, the foundational ideal of the United States, the radical notion that every single person has an inherent right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It was a promise of equality for all. But almost immediately, that promise was not just tested, it was broken. The Indian Removal Act legalized the forced relocation of tens of thousands of Native Americans. And that brutal journey, which we now know as the Trail of Tears, just stands in such stark contrast to the nation's founding ideals. And then there was slavery. Just look at this number. It is absolutely staggering. This represents the estimated number of enslaved Africans brought to the Americas in just the 25 years leading up to the Revolution. It was a system of human bondage that fueled the entire Southern economy and was just a poison in the nation's soul. So this drive to expand was powered by an idea called manifest destiny. This belief that America was somehow divinely ordained to stretch from coast to coast. And this belief, well, it was used to justify things like annexing Texas and starting a war with Mexico, a war which resulted in acquiring huge territories and only made the crisis over slavery even deeper. Would these new lands be free or slave? That crisis over slavery eventually pushed the country to what seems now like an inevitable breaking point. For decades, the nation tried to just paper over its deep divisions with political compromises. But it turns out, each attempt only made the coming storm more and more certain. The country kept trying to keep this fragile piece together. You had the Missouri Compromise in 1820, trying to balance slave and free states. Then the Compromise of 1850 traded California's freedom for a really brutal Fugitive Slave Act. Bleeding Kansas proved that letting settlers decide just led to bloodshed. And finally, John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, well, the South saw that as proof that abolitionists would stop at nothing. The time for compromise was officially over. This was the final spark. Abraham Lincoln, whose Republican Party was openly against the expansion of slavery, won the presidency. And he did it without a single electoral vote from the South. For the Southern states, this wasn't just an election, it was a declaration of war on their entire way of life. Secession was now a certainty. And so the nation plunged headfirst into its deadliest conflict. The Civil War wouldn't just decide the fate of the Union. It would forcibly destroy one version of America in order to create another one. It all began right here at Fort Sumter. The first shots of the Civil War were fired when Confederate cannons opened up on this federal fort. It was a clear act of rebellion, one that couldn't be ignored. President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the insurrection, and just like that, the war was on. The two sides had totally different ideas about how to win. The industrial North planned to literally squeeze the life out of the South with its Anaconda Plan, a huge naval blockade, while also capturing key cities. The agricultural South, on the other hand, just had to survive. Their plan was to fight a defensive war, wear down the North's will to fight, and hopefully win a big battle on Northern soil to force a peace. For 2 long years, the outcome was really in doubt. But in July of 1863, everything changed. In the East, the Union Army stopped Robert E. Lee's invasion at the Battle of Gettysburg. And at the exact same time, out in the West, Ulysses S. Grant captured the fortress of Vicksburg. That gave the Union total control of the Mississippi River. It was the turning point. The Confederacy would never recover. The cost of this war, it's almost unimaginable. Over 600,000 lives lost. That's more than all other American wars combined. It was the staggering price that was paid to preserve the Union and ultimately to end the institution of slavery. The war finally came to an end with Lee's surrender at Appomattox. The nation celebrated, but that joy was so tragically short-lived. Just 5 days later, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, leaving a fractured, grieving nation to face the enormous task of reconstruction without its trusted leader. What came next was this hopeful, chaotic, and ultimately tragic era we call Reconstruction. It was a time when the nation really tried to rebuild itself and figure out what freedom truly meant for all its people. In this incredible burst of progress, 3 new amendments to the Constitution fundamentally remade America. The 13th abolished slavery, period. The 14th granted citizenship and equal protection to everyone born in the U.S., and the 15th guaranteed the right to vote for Black men. This was like a second American Revolution, written right into the law. But that promise was not kept. In 1877, a backroom political deal to settle a contested presidential election led to the last federal troops being pulled out of the South. And that was it. That was the end of Reconstruction. It left 4 million newly freed African Americans at the mercy of white supremacist state governments and ushered in the dawn of the Jim Crow era. And that leaves us with this final, powerful question. The nation was forged in fire, first to create a union and then to remake it. The promise of equality was enshrined in the Constitution back in 1865, but the struggle to actually make that promise real, well, that would define the next century. And in so many ways, it continues to define America today.